things on our agenda today. One is to sort of finish our discussion we started last time on Christian ethics and a Christian ethic for engaging the culture. What I want to do today is particularly reflect on how the notion of the kingdom fits into this. Because I don't think that you can say that God's people engaging the culture and God's word structuring society and institutions is a distinctively Old Testament thing. Okay, now it's expressed differently in the Old Testament from the New. But the mandate, I'm going to try to make the case that the mandate for engaging the culture and taking care of the poor is actually grounded in our view of the kingdom. Right? That the kingdom, as prophesied and as will be fulfilled, has both an individual and a social component to it. Okay, so we'll spell that out as time goes on. And depending on how the time goes, I want to give as much time as we need to for that, but depending on how the time goes, I'd like to say a little bit more about natural law and a little bit about the use of Scripture in ethics too. All right? Okay. So where we've basically been, like I said, where we've been is where we ended last time was looking at a number of these biblical texts that specifically are focused on the responsibility of the people of God to pursue justice. Okay? And what I think we concluded, or what I concluded, and I'll trust that got from me to you, is that the pursuit of justice has a lot to do with the heart of God. It has a lot to do with genuinely living out our faith in community, and carried over into the New Testament, and is one of the characteristic components of the ministry of Jesus. So that what was begun in the poetic and prophetic literature was carried over without a lot of distinction by the preaching and teaching of Jesus. So that what I think is happening throughout Old and New Testament is this rather seamless portrait of the community of God's people being committed to the pursuit of justice in society at large, particularly focused on the least advantaged among us. Now, I don't think it's exclusively focused there, but I do think it's awfully difficult to say, in light of these texts, it seems to me. It's very difficult to say that a community of God's people is faithfully following Christ while neglecting or being callous to the least among us at the same time. It seems to me, although I wouldn't say that this is a constituent element of the gospel, I think that's the gospel, I think, is what Paul defines in 1 Corinthians 15 as the message of the cross and resurrection of Jesus. But certainly, I think it fits to say that our concern for the culture and more so the poor and the least among us is a constituent element of faithfully following Christ. And by constituent, I mean that it's a non-negotiable component, so that if you don't have that, you don't have the other. Okay? Yeah.
I'm trying to work through over the summer. You were going to be bringing.
Right. And see, I think part of the reason for that is to give sort of the things that I would consider to be a part of discipleship and more mandates of kingdom living, I think the temptation to include that under the heading of the gospel is, I think, done often to give it more compellingness. It has more persuasive punch to it. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, I think to say that that's a constituent element of following Christ, that's as good for me as to say it's a constituent element of the gospel. I mean, I don't see any difference in that in terms of its persuasiveness and compellingness. Now, I think that the challenge, for those that hold, and Cider does it. We saw Cider's Good News and Good Works from last time I cited that book. Cider does this too. In fact, and he makes the term salvation to be this really broad umbrella term, which I'm not sure the Scripture actually supports. But I guess if I was challenging your friend, I'd want to know, what's gained by putting it all under the umbrella of the gospel. I mean, what?
You seem to be wanting to give you your sin.
Right. That's the underlying agenda.
Right.
And of course, that's right. And so, yeah, what I think is motivating that is a desire to avoid what I'd call an old school pietism, which we defined the first week as a privatized faith. Now, again, I'm not sure that putting it under the heading of the gospel makes a big, I just don't see any difference.
It seems to be saying you're playing it out, the good news, the gospel, and you're calling it, you change it to the good news, or you say the gospel is the good news, and the good news is Jesus. So it kind of starts like a seed, and then you just
right.
let it blossom out.
I don't have a huge. Yeah. I think we need to. I'd want to push to be precise, and I think at the end of the day, we're going to end up in the same place, emphasizing the same things.
I hope so, but
well, then that may not be true. I think the Cider, for example, and we end up in basically the same place, emphasizing all the same things. And I don't see what he's gained by putting it under the term the gospel. So I guess it's more a plea to be sort of theologically precise, and I suppose I wouldn't give somebody a whole lot of grief if they want to talk about the whole gospel. That's sometimes how it comes out. The whole gospel really means faithfully following Christ. I'd rather use the terms of the kingdom and discipleship to spell that out. Yeah. And I think you're clearly right to define the gospel the way 1 Corinthians 15 does. Okay? Now, so let's take this a little bit further. We've already said that the purpose for the Old Testament law was to be more than just an individual moral code, right? That the purpose for the law was to create a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. Sometimes you hear the term that it's designed to create an ideal society. I'm not so sure that that's quite true. Because I think the law created a counterculture, no doubt, But the law also had a significant component of what I would call damage control. Right? It's hard. It's not the ideal would not countenance divorce, for example. And so the part in Deuteronomy 24, for example, when the Mosaic Law protects women who were at risk of being treated as property in divorce proceedings, I would call that damage control in a fallen world. Okay? Slavery was allowed, granted, practiced far more humanely than in any part of the ancient world. But slavery, in my view, functioned as largely a safety net for people who could no longer support themselves. Now, I'm reluctant to say that an ideal society is one in which human beings can own other human beings. And I would want to make the case that a society in which slavery was abolished is one that's morally superior to one in which slavery existed. Right? But in Old Testament times, slavery was allowed as a form of damage control so that the poor wouldn't be completely destitute and homeless. Okay? I think I would argue that polygamy was allowed as a form of damage control, as that safety net, largely for women in the ancient world. And now we can argue about polygamy because the Bible's not clear about that. But that's why I'd say the purpose of the law was not necessarily to set up an ideal, but rather a holy nation. Everybody go clear on the difference? Okay. So something distinct, and again, the purpose for the law was to structure society and institutions. Okay. Now, when the prophets come along, they pick up on this. And the vision of the kingdom that the prophets spell out includes this mandate for justice. And includes a mandate for what I would call a proper ordering of society. So that the things that the prophets preached so vehemently against, violence, injustice, oppression, exploitation, things like that, will no longer be around. I mean, those aren't even on the radar screen when the kingdom is consummated. Let me give you just one example of this in Isaiah 42. If you've had Old Testament, you'll know that Isaiah 42 is the first of the 4 servant songs of Isaiah that culminate in the vision in Isaiah 53 of the cross. But we don't often, we hear more about Isaiah 50 and 53 and less about 42 and 49. Because 42 and 49 give the vision of the servant of Yahweh as the kingly Messiah. Right? And notice in the first 4 verses, this is repeated, this is quoted in Matthew 12 as evidence of Jesus being the Messiah, the servant of Yahweh. Here's my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on the earth. and in his law the islands will put their hope. Right? Now, this gets expanded a bit in Isaiah 49, where it talks about the servant being a light to the nations. Restore the tribes of Jacob. This is in Isaiah 49:6. Bring back those of Israel I have kept. I will make you a light to the nations, that you may bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. Right? Now, it also goes on to say in verse 8 of Isaiah 49, in the time of my favor I will answer you. In the day of salvation I will help you. I will keep you and make you a covenant for the people, to restore the land, to reassign its desolate inhabitants. And then in verse 10, they will neither hunger nor thirst, nor will the desert heat or sun beat upon them. He who has compassion on them will guide them and lead them beside springs of water. All of those are very common figures of speech for what will take place when the kingdom is finally consummated. So, by the point being, in Isaiah 42 especially, the mission of the Messiah, the servant of Yahweh, in bringing the kingdom, is to bring forth justice both within the community of God's people and on the earth as a whole. So what this suggests, what this suggests, I think, if you guys over there see this, is that there's in our concept of the kingdom, there's a clear individual component to the kingdom, and this comes out in places like Jeremiah 31, the New Covenant, Ezekiel 36 brings out the same thing, where you will have, when the kingdom is consummated, you will have basically an earth's population full of regenerate people, right? Where the Spirit transforms people from the inside out. Now, in what both Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36 are speaking to is the ultimate fulfillment of those prophecies when the Lord returns, right? And we get, with the first coming of Christ, we get a down payment of that, right? Yes? Okay. Come on. If it gets too hot, I'm going to call you, though. All right? Okay. Now, what Isaiah 42, and there, I mean, we could cite a number of other prophetic visions of the kingdom to amplify this, but what they affirm is that there's also a social component to the kingdom. That the kingdom in its consummation will be more than just individuals rightly related to God. There will be a culture in which justice reigns supreme. Right? And I think the best way to describe that without getting into a lot of excess baggage is to call that a proper ordering of society. Another way to put this would be where God's will is being done on earth as it is being done in heaven. That's what they're praying for in the Lord's prayers, for the kingdom to be consummated. Another way to put this might be where the rule of God has been extended throughout individuals' lives, cultures, and institutions. Okay? Another way to put this might be where God's righteousness characterizes the culture at large and the institutions that make it up. Okay? Were you with me on this? Okay. So that when the kingdom was first announced in the Old Testament, that's what it looks like, right? I mean, I take it this is not breaking news, especially if you've had eschatology. Okay? Now, when the Lord returns, both these elements will be finally fulfilled. Right? So that you will have every knee bows to the name of Christ, and a society where God's righteousness is reflected everywhere and where justice reigns. Right? Okay, now, question then becomes, what happened at the first coming of Christ? Because Jesus actually said virtually nothing about the most grievous social evil that existed in the first century, right, which was slavery. Right? You guys all familiar with how slavery worked in the first century? Just for example, the average lifespan of a slave from when they started work on Herod's winter palace at Masada until they died was how long? 6 weeks. The average lifespan. So your assignment to work on Herod's palace at Masada was in essence a death sentence, and a swift one. Okay? Now, it's true that things like Paul's epistle to Philemon humanized slavery substantially, reflecting the Old Testament law. Right? But Jesus said virtually nothing about that. Paul and the other apostles, about all they said with regard to slavery was that slaves and free are equal in status before, as a result of being in Christ, and that slaves were to obey their masters, and if they'd escaped, go back to their owners. Okay? Hardly a social revolution, right? The early church said virtually nothing about the massive corruption in the Roman Empire. Said virtually, they said a little bit about the sexual practices that were rampant in the culture. Right? So the question is, what happened to that emphasis on justice that was so pronounced in the prophets, but at least the conventional wisdom is that at the coming of Christ, the gospel message, that's a pretty substantial shift of direction. Right? What do we say to that?
Do we have justice without the change that comes to us through Christ?
Definitely not. Right?
So,
no.
That's what happened when Christ came the first time. He provided the way for that change to occur so that justice could be brought in.
Okay. Although, interestingly, the church did end up turning the Roman Empire upside down. Right? I mean, the social upheaval that the early church created was actually enormous. Right?
Along the lines of justice, even people who hated the Christians were treated well by the
That's
Christians.
correct. Okay.
Even, you know, people that lived around Christians, even when they hated them, were well fed by the Christians.
Okay. Now, here's what typically, I think, in our eschatology, we see the cross as a down payment on the kingdom promises. Right? Kingdom was inaugurated. It was present largely because of the presence of the king. But only the full-blown amillennialists would say that the kingdom promises were completely fulfilled at the first coming of Christ. Right? So let me put it like this. Let's say that I agree to pay your tuition. Okay, hypothetically. Hypothetically, extremely hypothetically, and you tell me what the bill is for this fall, and I write you a check. Have I fulfilled my promise? Yeah, because it's a sizable check, actually. Yes, but what's the but?
That's not all of his tuition.
That's right. I fulfilled my promise so far, but I've fulfilled my promise, but not fully. Right? I've fulfilled my promise, but not exhaustively. Or to say another way, I fulfilled my promise, but I'm not done fulfilling my promise. Right? Okay. And with regard, I think, both to the individual and social components of the kingdom, the first coming of Christ was a down payment. It fulfilled the promise of the kingdom, but has not exhausted it. And we know clearly that at the second coming of Christ, the kingdom promises will be finally fulfilled. Okay? Now again, you know from reading the prophets that sometimes the prophets didn't always distinguish between initial and final fulfillments of prophecy. They just saw phenomena being fulfilled. And the New Testament helps us clarify some of those distinctions that I don't think the prophets would have been surprised with, but I'm not sure that they always were aware of all of those distinctions that the New Testament would clarify. Okay? I know that's a bigger hermeneutical question too. Okay? Yeah, question?
Just kind of comment this in general. It's still a...
No, it is. It's a challenging point. But I think the New Testament I think is pretty clear on that, on those distinctions, and that the kingdom promises are fulfilled in stages. Okay? Now, what you may say that's a nice little excursus on eschatology, but so what? Well, here's the so what, it seems to me. That in this interim, and I'm using that term really carefully because I do not see the present age as a parenthesis in the kingdom program. Right? That's the really older school dispensationalism that I think actually led to a privatized faith. And this is why it's so important, I think, to see that the kingdom was definitively introduced and inaugurated and we are living in a present form of the kingdom now. Okay? All right? That's not crucial just for our spiritual life. That's crucial for our worldview on this. Okay? So that in the interim, which will maybe describe it maybe something like that. The church then has obligations to both the individual and social components of the kingdom. Right? We have the individual obligations to proclaim the gospel and disciple individuals. Okay? But in the interim as well, we have obligations to the social component to work for justice and a rightly ordered society in ways that help us. They don't usher in the kingdom, but they anticipate what will be fulfilled when the kingdom comes in its fullness. Now, just one caution on this. I'd be really careful that we don't set this up as a contrast between the Great Commission and the church's social ministry. Okay? Because it seems to me that the mandate to the church for both of these fits under the broader umbrella of the Great Commission. Right? What does the Great Commission tell us to do? Go, make disciples, and then the part that we leave out sometimes, teaching them to observe all that Jesus has commanded, okay? Which, as we saw last time, certainly includes the mandate for cultural engagement, particularly toward the least among us. So, we'd say the Great Commission has priority. As long as you define the Great Commission correctly and include what Jesus has taught us as well in terms of our engagement with the culture. All right? So I would not want to set this up as a distinction between justice and the Great Commission. Okay? Now, what do we do with the person who says, but, the world's going to hell in a handbasket, right, prior to the Lord's return? So don't give me this stuff about the church's role with the culture. All you're doing is rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, because that's going down. Isn't the church's role to pluck as many people off that sinking ship through evangelism and discipleship? What do we say to that? You've got an answer to everything I'm posing today, don't you?
What is discipleship other than becoming like Christ? And if we become like Christ, we will do the things that He taught us to do, and through that, we will draw people to
Okay. Him. All right. So one of the ways to respond to that is to go back to the Great Commission and say the Great Commission includes those things that Jesus taught, right, as well as evangelism and discipleship. Okay? Here's the other way that I would respond to this, and think about what will happen. What does the New Testament tell us about the progress of the gospel prior to the Lord's return? What's that? It will, but what will the response to the gospel be prior to the Lord's return? Apostasy is at an all-time high, right? Yeah. Right? I mean, people are going to reject the gospel in record numbers prior to the Lord's return, right? But when's the last time we heard somebody conclude, well, why don't we just jettison the Great Commission then? No, that doesn't follow at all. In fact, if anything, we would suggest what? Just the opposite, wouldn't we? Now, again, the bigger picture on this, and hold just for a second. The bigger picture on this is that in both of these components of the kingdom, changing the culture and changing individuals' lives, the progress or lack of it is not a relevant criteria for assessing our success at that, right? It's required that God's servants be what, primarily? Faithful, not successful, right? I've been beating my head working with the abortion debate for the last 20 years. We are no closer to overturning Roe v. Wade than we've ever been, and I think the chances of that happening in our lifetime is probably slim to none. There are still roughly 1 million abortions a year that go on. Now I think we've made a dent in that. But the unborn are still probably the most at-risk element of our culture today. And the womb is still one of the most dangerous places in the world for a child. Does that mean that we ought to give up and just preach the gospel? Now, I think we ought to be preaching the gospel, don't get me wrong. But the mandate in the Scripture is to be faithful to what God's called us to do. You don't call the shots on whether someone comes to faith or not. Right? Right? Your job is not to win people to Christ. Right? Your job and mine is to faithfully proclaim the gospel message and make it as compelling as we can and invite people to respond. But that bringing people to faith is God's responsibility at the end of the day. Okay? In the same way, turning our culture around, this is where Hunter, in his book To Change the World, is absolutely right. Turning the culture around, at the end of the day, is ultimately God's responsibility. Right? Now, it's our task to be faithful to what God's called us to do in this. Okay? And remember what we said last time, that God has called different people in different communities to different things. Okay? Thankfully, not all of you are called to do the same thing that I'm doing. Right? Now, the other part of this is we have to situate this interim, we have to situate that sociologically a bit too. Because we have to raise the question, why was this not a huge emphasis in the early church? Which I think we have to be fair about that and admit that it was not. Now, why? But that raised the question of why. You want to respond to that, or do you have another question? Go ahead.
Well,
Go ahead.
just directly to that, focusing on that, assuming you
Okay.
know.
That's exactly right. Okay. Now, the other part of that, there's another assumption that was readily made in Jewish circles in the first century that I think we often miss. And that is how close the tie was between the religious community in first century Israel and the socio-political powers that be, or the socioeconomic powers that be. They were the religious system and the socioeconomic system in first century Israel were tied really closely together. Okay, so take, for example, when Jesus cleansed the temple, right, why were people so upset?
Loss of revenue.
Right? I mean, Jesus disrupted a very profitable business, primarily because it was exploiting the poor and using religion as a cover for that. I mean, it was blatantly manipulative of the least among us. Okay? Now, it wouldn't be hard to look at Jesus' cleansing of the temple to say, essentially you've made a monetary transaction out of a spiritual thing and let it go at that. But that would not, in my view, would not explain the level of anger that arose in the aftermath of that. Right? We see some similar parallels when Paul was preaching in some parts of Greece and Asia Minor. That the reason people reacted like they did is because of the disruption of a very profitable and fundamentally exploitive business. Right? Now, the other thing sociologically that we need to be aware of is, remember, the church, the first century church was a relatively small, intensely persecuted minority. And the options for impacting the broader culture when you are a small, persecuted minority are sociologically pretty significantly limited. In fact, the miracle of the first century church is they had the impact they did while being a persecuted minority at the same time. Now, in essence, the first century church did social change about the only way that was available to them. Okay? Direct involvement in the culture was simply not an option. Right? Rome was not a democracy. There was no avenue to redress grievances like we have in a democracy. What they did was about the only thing available to them, was to form distinct countercultural communities that radically lived out their faith. Now, today, that's the least to which we are called, to form radical countercultural communities that live out our faith and that live out the social dimension of our faith. But we also have opportunities to impact the culture and to live out our faith publicly in ways that simply were not available in the first century. And I think some of the emphasis of the first century church, some of it clearly is theological. But some of it also, it seems to me, is sociological. And that just because the first century church did not engage in direct social change or direct political involvement, if you will, that's irrelevant for today. Right? Because we do lots of things today for which there is no explicit New Testament precedent. Like sitting in seminaries. Okay? But we'd say, so what? That there's no explicit New Testament precedent for that. The question is our involvement in the broader culture violating some explicit or implicit New Testament principle or virtue? In fact, it seems to me that taking advantage of every opportunity to publicly live out our faith is actually fulfilling the spirit of what Jesus taught us that we take in the Great Commission. So, I'm not sure that, well, let's put it this way. What the first century church did so well is what we are called to do today. And you'll see this is a lot of the Anabaptist emphasis today on being a countercultural community, living out our faith, but otherwise being not isolated is not really the right term, but maybe a benign indifference to where the culture is going. I may come back and eat those words eventually. That may not be quite accurate. That's some Anabaptist friends who I think would probably take issue with that. But the Anabaptist folks they have no place for engagement in the political arena or structural societal change like that. It's all about living out our faith in our communities. That's the explicit New Testament example. But I don't think our engagement with the culture is limited to that. In fact, I don't see any good reason to limit it to that. In fact, if you think about, take for example, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And let's imagine that parable was repeated on the same spot of the Jericho Road night after night after night. And the same guy, on his way home from work, comes across another person who's been beaten and left for dead in the same place. And night after night, he picks up a different person, puts him on his donkey, takes him to the innkeeper, and says, "Here, put it on my tab." Okay? And that goes on for months and months and months. Okay? Now, what's going to happen? Pretty soon, that guy's going to run out of money to pay the bill. The innkeeper is not going to do it for free. The insurance company will definitely cut him off at some point. Okay? But what would we say about that approach to solving a very real problem? Okay? The mandate is still there, okay? But I think we raise a valid and good question about the means that are being employed to take care of that mandate. Yeah.
Why would you just try and stop crime at that
Right.
point?
That's exactly right. 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 Why wouldn't we do something that might be more structural or more proactive? This is what I mentioned last time about that approach to the Good Samaritan was huge. But that's primarily picking up the pieces at the bottom of the cliff after people have already fallen. Right? And what would be, in fact, I think we'd probably say, if that's all we do, that's poor stewardship. That's what I tell the guy who comes and rescues the guy. He's ready. The huge bill he's got at the end. Say, surely there's a better way to deploy our resources, to provide genuine help. This is why I told you guys last time about the people on Minnie Street, Santa Ana, and the notarios who were ripping them off. Okay? We could have just continued to offer care and compassion to them, but instead we tried to do something a little more structural that might prevent others from being victimized. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. I think it's good stewardship. And it's certainly consistent with the mandate, as we saw in the Psalms, in the prophets, to plead the case, to take up the cause, to defend the rights of the least among us.
I've thought about this a little bit in terms of making disciples. All the money that's spent on, drugs and prisons and violence and crime, and all the brokenness in our society.
That's right.
We're just attacking that with money and resources and money and resources. But if you change a heart, not we.
That's right.
You know, if we're making
That's
disciples
right.
and God's changing hearts, I think a lot of those things seem like
That's right. That's right. And that would be one place where the gospel is the proactive thing. Right? Yeah, which is what they're finding, actually, no charge for this. But what's increasing its inroads in the prison system now and making a significant difference is not only the gospel, it's also Islam. That's making exactly the same argument. Which is why folks like Colson and Prison Fellowship are so important, because they figured that out some time ago, that the only way to affect the rates at which people come back to prison is by changing their moral compass, with an internal conversion. That's how it's being done, right?
cleared up things in our individual lives.
All right, that's
Saves
right.
money, it's more
Right. Okay. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how my church has put shoe leather on this and made it happen. We started this about probably almost 30 years ago, when the church was at a really interesting place. It had been a revolving door for pastors, and we had just, according to our narrative, we had just inadvertently planted the fastest growing church in America by firing our pastor, and he had gone basically about 3 or 4 miles down the road and started what became the fastest growing church in the United States in the 1980s. And Art Mariners was we were down to probably 250, 300 people, and the elders were giving, not serious is probably too strong, but it was on the table for discussion to close the doors. And the church, I'd just been hired about a year ago, and had a young senior pastor who's still there today, and we just kind of started plugging away. And the elders had $10,000 that they had saved for the rainy day, sort of when all Sheol broke loose, which would not have surprised anybody at the time. And instead, the senior pastor tasked some of the staff to gather a group from the church who were interested, and we spent probably 6 to 9 months studying Scripture together about the church's obligation to our community. And we were blown out by not only how much the Bible had to say about this, but how strong it was. And I've given you sort of some of the highlights of that. And so we decided against the better judgment of the elders to take that $10,000 and start the church's outreach to the least among us in our community. And we picked 3 organizations that we divvied up $3,300 each to partner with. One was the Orange County Rescue Mission, which was basically a homeless shelter. The other was the Living Well Clinic in the city of Orange, just adjacent to St. Joseph's Hospital, which was a clinic for unwed mothers. The third was an organization called the Sheepfold. I don't even know if that's around today, but it's a shelter for, basically for battered women primarily and their children. And we said initially that part of the conditions for giving money to these organizations was that we could have a genuine partnership with them, so that our people from the church could get involved serving in these organizations. The first year we did it on that $10,000. The second year we took a special offering just for this. And it just was off the charts how excited people were about getting involved in this. And it's evolved today. As it grew, what we found was that some of the organizations we were partnering with were not equipped to accommodate as many volunteers as we were providing for them. And so we realized we ended up having to do some of these things on our own. Because the organizations, we had a bigger vision, because we just had the numbers of people who we had who wanted to get involved was so huge. Today, that component of the church's ministry has about $1.5 million budget. It's all raised in 2 separate offerings that are taken at 2 different times during the year. And we describe, and I'm so proud of my church for the way we framed this, because it is just considered part of every person's spiritual journey to get involved with the poor and the least among us. And it's just part of the package. And we've had, I'd say, a number of things that I would call just home run outreach. The Mini Street thing is one. We've had the Royal Family Kids Camp. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a week-long camp for neglected and abused and orphaned kids. And each person who goes as a counselor is assigned a kid that they shepherd for the week. And we had hundreds of adults take a week's vacation, and they come back. I'll never forget the sight. They come back, and they're telling about this kid that they've had a chance to love for a week. And some of the strongest, sharpest business people in our church turn into complete basket cases when they're describing their experience with this. I mean, it's powerful and profound. And we're moving more into some of the specifically justice-oriented types of things, particularly overseas. We're getting involved overseas. We've got partnerships with churches in Southeast Asia where we're partnering with them to get involved, doing more that deals with sexual slavery and with prostitution and the way young girls are abused. And some of that's real specific. We've got people in our churches who have law enforcement experience, for example, who are really ideally suited to come and be parts of these operations. And some of the things we're doing do require some special expertise, but most of it is just hands and feet on the ground. We take our high school group, goes every Memorial Day weekend, and they build 30 or 40 houses for a community that we've adopted. It's, and remember, our stuff started out really small, just a drop in the bucket. But we've watched God work in some really incredible ways. And those of us who were around when this was launched, we sort of pinch ourselves and we think, this is way beyond what anybody expected. But it started small, and it stayed small for a long time. But I think the trick was we saw this as we read the Scripture. And we saw this as part of a person's spiritual formation. And we put it, and we do this with going overseas too. We see short-term missions thing as just part of everybody's spiritual journey. And I think we framed it right. And so there's in here, thank you for collecting my books so nicely. I appreciate that. In here, you've got other examples. Some of these are very conservative evangelical churches, but some are, I would consider, more mainline denominational. And the mainline folks have done well in this. I don't think they've done as well at the other component of the Great Commission, which has to do with the proclamation of the gospel.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.